Okay, so let's kick off. So I'm Andrew Wilks. I do want to acknowledge that we're standing on the ground of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and if there are any of our First Nation brothers or sisters who are either in the room or on the call, I'd like to welcome you particularly to this session. I will introduce the panelists in a moment or two. I have a rather checkered history. I used to be a proper scientist. And the antonym of that is not improper scientist, but is a translational scientist now, and I've been in that field for 20 years. I started drug discovery companies and biotech companies and so forth. And I found myself, and I now look at my name badge, and I'm a venture capitalist. And that's not the career path my mother would have chosen for me, but it's one that I've ended up in, and one that has my future involvement in this sector. I'm really delighted that we've been able to put this particular session into this program. It's my strong belief that everyone on this panel is no less committed to the delivery of new therapeutics and improvement of patient health than anyone else in the academy. We play a very significant and important role in the translation of those brand new ideas, those innovations that come from the basic research and find the way through a contorted commercial translation process into the patient's armory of therapeutics. And so it is important that this gets canvassed and it is something that gets discussed. In particular, around this is the notion of not just innovation, but entrepreneurship. I've got a couple of slides in a minute. I think, in Australia perform miserably in our ability to translate and commercialize the amazing science that we have created in our basic sciences. And the members of this panel all have a particular interest and expertise in that process, and hopefully, as we build the discussion here, we can start to talk about how we might improve, how we might do better in terms of translating that science. I'll go to the next slide and then come back. I want to talk a little bit around culture, entrepreneurial culture, and I think that's a really important part of this conversation, something we don't do particularly well here. And we've got Anne-Laure Puaux, who's the business director of this very institute, of the Walter Lazar Hall Institute, and is therefore charged with an important role, not just for this institute, but as a flagship of certainly Victorian research and possibly Australian research, sort of engendering a more translational culture in our academic pursuits. And she'll be able to talk a little bit about how WEHI and more broadly other academic organizations might do that bit. We have probably a real venture capitalist in the group, someone who can take the heat off me. That's Mike Bettess. Mike is a senior investment manager at the most well-regarded and biggest life sciences fund, Brandon Capital. He can talk about capital, what the capital markets are like, and how that translational research gets funded. And then we have connectivity. Connectivity and continuity, if you like, of how that translation piece happens, how we as academics interact with small commerce and how small commerce interacts with big pharma, big business. And we have Bronwyn Kingwell, who had a terrific career as an academic scientist, but is now in a senior role, and you'll probably describe it better than I would at CSL. So we'll be able to ask Bronwyn about that. This is really just to continue the alliteration. Catering is a metaphor more around a place where we might find, where all phenotypes of people involved in this process might meet and collaborate and communicate. I think the efficiency of our ability to translate those early stage discoveries through to the final therapeutics that end up in humans can only benefit from this sort of venue where the phenotypes that we express are in in the same forum as people who think about, you know, health care delivery to patients. I think that's a tremendous opportunity for both of us to, or both groups to think about each other's problems. So just to set the scene and just to show how miserably we do perform or have performed hitherto in this sector, I did a little bit of literature research a while ago. And this is really because John Brumbury was out there sprouting the fact that we as a sector here in Victoria were, you know, punching above our weight, that we were excellent in terms of the science that we were doing. And so I asked that very question, and I created this goodness index, which is essentially all the papers that were published in the life sciences, just in this Parkville postcode, all the papers that were published in Parkville, and the citations that were made on those papers between 2000 and 2020, so not including very many of my own, because I kind of finished as an academic around about that time, divided by the number of humans involved in the generation of that. So a measure of impact and the measure of sort of on a pound per pound basis. And compared San Francisco, clearly the mothership of biotech, San Diego, which I think is my favorite place where biotech goes on, Boston, Massachusetts, London, Cambridge, and of course Parkville. How did we compare? How did we do in terms of delivery of product, of impactful product in the life sciences? And the answer is pretty well. I mean, we are kind of neck and neck in terms of this quantitative measure of how well we do in terms of our product. We are right in line with San Diego and perhaps a little bit behind Stanford, and on a par with Boston. Boston has many people in the sector. They deliver a whole bunch more papers and a whole bunch more citations, but pound for pound, we're doing pretty well. And of course, we feel very smug and very self-satisfied by that observation, but it is measured or mitigated or in some way evidenced by this slide here that we are absolutely dreadful at translating those early stage discoveries into companies, into spin-out companies, into vehicles that can convey those discoveries, those early stage projects through to a place where they can be tested clinically and ultimately applied to patients. You know, in San Diego, there are, and I spent a lot of time in San Diego, there are thousands of biotechs just down from Torrey Pines Road. There is a real sense of entrepreneurism. There isn't a single professor in UCSD or any of the Salk and Stanford Burnham institutes who is not a founder of a biotech or involved in the translation of his or her own research. And yet here in Parkville, despite the performance that we had shown in that graph, we have done miserably in creating our own spin-out culture, our own spin-out companies. I think that's to our own detriment. We are leaving cash on the table quite clearly here, and perhaps worse than that, we are leaving therapeutics on the table. That's to our own disappointment and shame, I suspect. So I'm going to get the insight of these good people on the panel, all of whom have been involved in this particular activity over a period of time, and ask them what they think the problem is, how they each feel that we can contrive to improve our performance in it, and perhaps then ask members of the audience how you feel about this question and where it can all go. So the first question, we got access to capital. We'll talk about that, and we'll get Mike to talk about that. Tyranny of distance. How do we connect? How do we communicate with the natural markets for those products that we might develop? And the entrepreneurial culture, which I think is something we must spend some time in discussing. It's the tall poppy syndrome, the license first, startup second hypothesis, and then the question of, are all of the staff members in the universities and research institutes here simply employees, or are they entrepreneurs in waiting, ready to pounce on the development of their own technology and create the businesses and the therapeutics of the future. I'm going to start with Anne-Laure and ask you, well, so I guess it really does start with the academic organizations, their ability to engender an entrepreneurial mindset and provide the opportunities to those entrepreneurs to actually produce the goods. So how do you guys handle it? What are your thoughts on how you can improve, and where should all this should all this head?
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and thanks for the opportunity to participate to this wonderful panel. So, very interesting question. I'd like to start by summarizing what are the key barriers for the academic scientists to be more commercially minded and entrepreneurial, in my opinion, and based on my experience. I think the number one issue that we can see in basically every university or academic institution is really the lack of incentives. I think generally speaking, academic researchers are, stuck a little bit in this pathway and this mindset really that, they need to publish obviously, and then they need publications to get grant money. And then when they get grant money, this is to do more publication and so on and so forth. And so quite often, generally, any commercial effort is really seen as an issue to be dealt with, because then you will have some impact on your publication, and people are quite worried about that and what would be basically a negative impact on their academic careers. And I think that's really the number one problem. So I think there are some other issues that we are facing. Another one, which is quite important as well, is the lack of knowledge and understanding of the investment, what it takes to secure investment, what it takes to develop a drug. It's a very long and complex process. And I think this lack of knowledge is a little bit everywhere. Within the scientific community sometimes, but also within the business development and technology transfer offices in universities. And for example, I know in Europe is really a big problem as well. And the last point, I think the last barrier I would like to flag is in some universities, sometimes there is a little bit of rigidity around the intellectual property policies, and they see commercialization happening in a certain way, which is not always realistic. And associated to that, the lack of legal support, which I think is really a big problem, because no matter how entrepreneurial you want to be, maybe your scientists want to make it happen, commercial people are all there, but if all the contracts are stuck somewhere because the legal department is busy doing more important things or managing more important risks for the organization, then you are not going to get anywhere. So how to address those challenges? Well, I think in terms of the incentive, it's really not an easy problem to solve, because academic research is global, and those incentives around grant money and publication is really, they are there everywhere, and I think not easy to solve. But I think at the level of every institution, there is a way to add some incentives and recognize those efforts really. And I think if we all do this effort, somehow things will change, and they're changing already. In terms of being rigid, I think it's really important for an institution to retain the flexibility in the type of partners, the type of deals. Every project is different. That's the beauty of it. So people should not go in a certain way about it, but remain flexible. I think having a business development team which has deal-making track record and also, if possible, buyer-side experience is really useful as well. And of course, the dedicated legal support. But I think maybe the most important point is the buy-in across the organization around culture change, because culture change is very difficult, especially in academic institutions. And so I think, if the top leadership in the university or the medical research institute is not really convinced and leading the change, I think there is very little chance it will actually happen. It takes time, and it is quite hard, but with the top leadership there, I think it really can happen. So maybe a few examples of things that we did at WEHI. So I've been in charge of business development and commercialization of research at WEHI for the past 4 years. And I want to maybe summarize quickly a few of these initiatives that we've been putting in place that I believe have moved the needle already in 4 years. So in terms of scientific incentives, what we've done, of course, is providing the knowledge through education programs at WEHI. I think that's really important, you know, that so that people can understand what it looks like and what is required. Also providing the career development pathways and financial incentives actually to the scientists so that they really embrace it. And very importantly, we have now included commercialization and entrepreneurship into the staff promotion criteria, including the lab heads, which I think is really crucial. Because if not, then if people are only judged on their grant money and the publication, then it's really not easy for them, right? I mean, you get what you incentivize for in a way. We also have, like many other institutions, a policy to distribute a portion of commercial income to our contributors. So they receive personal money for their contributions, and I think this is really important. And we have also, we are developing at the moment a new career pathway for commercial scientists. So scientists who work in the lab, who work with the business development, who generate data, but their only KPI is commercial progress and not publications. And we also work with scientists and we empower them to take a leading role. They come with us as part of deal teams, and they are supported when they want to take a leading role in industry collaborations and startups as well. You know, success is really breeding success in a way. So when people have a positive experience, it becomes a success story, and that makes things much, much easier. And the last point at WEHI was about all those big initiatives that we've invested in together with the government, and which are really translational platforms that are required effectively to start the journey in commercialization. For example, for drug discovery and development, so we have a screening capability under the form of the National Drug Discovery Center. Now we have a Center for Biologics Therapies in collaboration with CSL since last year. We also, with CSL and the University of Melbourne and Rector Victoria, we are creating the first biotech incubator with wet lab space here in Melbourne, not in Parkville, but very close to Parkville. And we are working toward the creation of an internal investment fund to support our projects. So I think really enabling the people and incentivizing them is really important. And I would like to finish by the benefits that we can see of those approaches. I mean, why, in a way, why do we want them to be more commercial and entrepreneurial? I think just to keep it simple, there are really two key benefits that we are aiming for. One is really to have more impact. Because, you know, no matter how you look at it, if one day you have the chance to have a drug or a vaccine that is used globally for people and for patients, that's really the best kind of impact any scientist could dream about. And long term, we are also aiming at generating those financial returns that can then be reinvested into research, to make really breakthrough discoveries, and also a little bit break the cycle of the publications and the grant funding. And as everyone knows, funding landscape is more and more difficult for research grants. So yeah, that's my conclusion. Thank you, Andrew.
So that's fantastic. And I had a lot of points there. There are a couple we can pick up on a little later. One is top-down leadership in terms of entrepreneurial culture. I think that's something that, since we have a lot of top people in the audience, their point of view might be something that we can canvass a little later. The other one is alignment of incentives. And I'm going to contend a little bit that they're not quite aligned despite the proposal. We've had this conversation a few times, Anne-Laure, I know. But I think that's a really important point, alignment of incentives. And the other one is access to capital. Just setting up a fund here, I think that's something going to be unique in the sector. But let's talk to somebody who knows a bit about capital, who's been putting capital That's you, yes. Mike, let's talk about the capital environment, cash for, I mean, this is a situation, as Roy and HG would say, too much money is never enough, and we're never going to get there, but how are we sitting? What's going on?
Actually, can you repeat that? No, it doesn't sound.
Not quite.
Okay, that's right. So the capital environment at the moment is probably the best it's been, well, since ever in Australia. So there's capital floating around at the moment. But I think if we just take a step back and we remember your slide from a minute ago, Andrew, about your comparison that you did around publications, I think it's worth just having a think about a few things. So when you look at those jurisdictions, those areas where you have really vibrant biotechnology industries, vibrant capital industries, there are 4 criteria, and we spoke about this the other day, Andrew, but there's 4 criteria that you'll generally see in those areas. One is great research. You'll see really good research. And I think, Australia, Melbourne does really great with its research. The research is fantastic. But I think there's 3 other points that we lack. And one is access to capital. And yes, capital is better here now than it's ever been, but compared to what they've got access to in the US, it's a drop in the ocean, right? If you could put all of the funds together in Australia into one fund, that would be just probably one fund. In the US, there's funds that have multiples of the amount of money that we have to exercise. So that makes a difference. The second thing that makes a difference is personnel, people who really understand the business. It takes a community to raise a child, and it takes a community to get a drug onto the market. It's not just something that you can just run out of the lab with and talk to your tech transfer office, raise a bit of money, and you're on your way. You need people who come in with different skills at every step of the journey, and it costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time to get these drugs to market. And so finding people for us as investors is a massive challenge. And in particular, if you look at those jurisdictions we talked about, they are flush with talent, right? So you can't go into Boston and sit down in a cafe and start talking about your confidential project, because you can be guaranteed everyone at the coffee tables around you will know exactly what you're talking about, right? That doesn't happen here. And the fourth point, which is really, really hard to fix, is proximity to natural acquirers, right? So proximity to the large pharma companies who end up buying the companies that we seed and that we build. And, people do deals, right? And so it's that ability to sit down in a cafe, or your kids play sport with the guy you should be talking to at the company that you're trying to sell your assets to, makes a big difference. Atlas Ventures, one of the great venture firms in the US at the moment, which is very focused on early stage research. Apparently they do a lot of their deals at their portfolio review at Cape Cod when they go on the yachts with everyone, right? And they get out on the boats and make a holiday out of it. It's very hard for us to do that and to compete on that sort of level. And so all of those are Venn diagrams: research, capital, people, industry. They all mix together. And when we lack the 3 at the other end, it makes it incredibly difficult for us. However, that said, access to capital now is better than it's ever been. And we've got a generational chance now to make this work. And I think that's where the pressure is, and that's where the government is looking towards us, and our investors are looking towards us, not necessarily to make massive financial returns, but to have, obviously don't lose money, right? That's the first point. But also make a difference, environmental, social good. And so our investors at Brandon Capital, so we manage about 800 million at the moment through various funds. A lot of that has been invested, so we're obviously looking to raise a new fund, get some new funds to invest. But our investors are CSL, so Bronwyn works for CSL, who's an investor in us, plus the superannuation funds who all come together and put money into us. So if you can imagine a superannuation funds and CSL writing checks between 20 to 60 million to put into a fund that collectively is about a $250 million fund, we're never going to move the needle for them, right, when we make a return. We're never going to make a difference to CSL's bottom line. We make a difference to them because they can say, hey, we've obviously made a bit of money, but look at the impact that we've had, right? We've been able to put money into the research environment in Australia and New Zealand, and we've been able to create these great companies and these great benefits. And that's what the superannuation firms are looking for as well. But if we lose the money, there won't be any more. The music will stop. And so that's where the pressures of funds like us to make sure that we're working well with people like Anne-Laure and WEHI and where all the great research is, and also looking at co-investors and other people around the world to make sure we're competing on a global scale. So that's kind of where I see it sitting at the moment, Andrew. And it's great. I think more funds coming in, like your fund, is only a good thing. because, you know, funds are run by people, and, you know, people make mistakes, right? They don't always get it right. And so what might be a great deal for us may not be a great deal for other venture funds, and vice versa. And the more shots we have on goal and the more opportunities we have, you know, I think the better opportunities we have for our projects to make a return. And I'll leave it there, Andrew, unless you
That's
want me to
great.
say anything else.
No, and I think we're all being nice to Anne-Laure because, of course, we all want to do deals with WEHI all the time.
And I agree with everything Anne-Laure said, by the way.
Of course, so do I. I agree more than you do, in fact. You talked about proximity to acquirers and stuff, and we have one unicorn in Australia, and that's CSL, and we have a representative from CSL, and the real question there is what do they want? How can we foment cross-sector partnerships between academia and industry? In their mind, how does the SME biotech sort of business fit in to what they see as the local environment? And maybe you can speak for CSL, or perhaps not for CSL, and say what you think about all that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think I'd like to comment in two respects. One on that sort of connectivity and where the big players fit into the whole landscape, but also on your fourth point, Mike, about the dearth of big industry in Australia, and, you know, what would have to change to you know, fix that. So let's start with the connectivity issue, because you know, I think getting all the different partners together to get mutual understanding of the different objectives and the different languages that all the different sectors speak is really very important. And first of all, one sort of advertisement for the Academy. I think it's fantastic that the Academy is now getting industry fellows into the Academy. It's one way that we can start to connect the different sectors and perhaps do a bit of matchmaking amongst, you know, some of the entrepreneurs within the fellows, and you know, people like yourself, Andrew, venture capitalists, and people in small startups and so forth. So I think that's fantastic. And Andrew's chair of the Industry Fellowship Committee for the Academy, and it's up to us to start
We're
pulling
canvassing
people in.
for interest, so I think that's a timely advert.
Yeah. But then I think there's some other great mechanisms that are out there that we could, you know, even as an academy, start to advocate for more. I think one of the fantastic schemes that's been running for the last few years are the READY fellowships out of the MRFF. These are the Research Exchange Development for Industry program. And these are fellowships that are given to candidates from academic institutes or startups, actually, Andrew, as well. So the funding goes to their institutions and allows those individuals to work within industry for a year. And it could be a small startup, you know, from academia to a small startup, or small startup into big industry. And they actually work within the company for 12 months. And they really get to have a good understanding of the drug development process, the types of data packages that industry is looking for to de-risk opportunities so that they will invest. And it's, you know, it builds, I think, on some of the programs that WEHI might have, the entrepreneur type programs, to actually give real life opportunities. And then they have to go back to their original institution, whether that be academia or their original startup, with those learnings. Now these fellowships, I think, are in their final round, unfortunately. I think that was set up to run for 3 years. And, you know, I think as a sector we should be advocating for these types of schemes to continue, and, you know, maybe it's something we can get together and talk about how we might advocate as a community to keep these schemes running. From an industry perspective, CSL tries to encourage engagement. We have funding schemes that are available, again, to academics or small startups, which are usually funded as a collaboration. It's like a normal scientific collaboration, but we, as an industry partner, work together to craft the research plans, so that at the end of the collaboration, which is typically 2 years, we've got a data package which will allow us to make a decision as to whether we would want to invest and move forward with that program. So these are collaborations with an option agreement at the end, so an option agreement for licensing. And it's very important that the industry partner understands the needs of the collaborator, that we can publish after IP protection. Need that IP protection, of course, first, but then after that you can publish. And then we look at the option agreement at the end. If we don't take up the option, we want to make sure the academic's free to go off, shop it elsewhere, or do whatever. So I think these types of schemes are really important. And again, I think most big industry have these types of schemes. So that's a little bit on the connectivity piece. The other thing I'd like to comment on is, how do we attract more big pharma, big biotech into Australia to just, complete that ecosystem and create that, vibrant environment where we get translation all the way to products for patients. So I guess competition globally is really fierce to attract industry to the shores of any one company. Now, Australia is a great place to live. It's a great place to work. I think you'd all agree, but it's a bad place to do business. If you look at company tax rates in Australia compared to peer nations globally, we are taxed, very highly. It's just not attractive. So our company tax rates here are about 30%. They're 20% in the US, I think 19 in the UK, 15 in Switzerland. So if you're setting up a business, you're not incentivised to set up in Australia. And what we need to attract big pharma are market-based type incentives, not one-off handouts. For industry to make long-term commitment, they have to be able to do sound financial planning to know how the business models will work. And as I said, it's just not attractive. The last government did have in their budget, I think it was the 21-22 budget, a patent box. And this is a scheme whereby patents that are Australian-based, any returns on those patents would be taxed at a concessional rate of 17%. Now, something like that is really attractive. Unfortunately, in the sort of design and implementation, it's all sort of fallen by the wayside at the moment. It's in a bit of limbo. But these are the types of mechanisms that I think as a sector we should be advocating for. Industry should be advocating for funding in basic research, and I think likewise, as part of the ecosystem as a community, we might want to think about the incentives that connect the dots to make sure we can translate all the way and have more sovereign capacity in R&D and manufacturing based here in Australia. So,
terrific. And just to take you up on one thing, I mean, CSL actually makes a profit. I've never been involved with a company that's actually made a profit and therefore never had to worry about what the tax rate is. And for the likes of us, importantly for the likes of us,
yes.
there is the R&D tax incentive. And so if you make a loss,
Yes.
you can get 43% of your expenditure on research back as cash to invest in the next year. I think that's a massive, massive opportunity. So for small biotech and for the sorts of companies that I've been involved in, those settings do feel pretty good.
Absolutely, Andrew, and I was remiss not to mention that. But for a company like CSL, which is a growth company, unless there's returns, they can't. We can't reinvest back into the research, and there's no growth. So
we'll come back to some of those points. We've been lucky enough to drag David back from the previous session. And quite a wonderful talk. I thought AI clearly is the future. Are we drinking our own Kool-Aid here, the rest of us on this panel? You've been in CSIRO, you've been in academia, you've started companies. Is anything we've said in the last half an hour reasonable or true from the coalface experience that you've had?
Well, one of the advantages of coming last is that everyone said things before you that you kind of agree with, and I think I've certainly had a lot of resonance with what's been said already. My experience, I guess I had 32 years at CSIRO, which is not a company and it's not academia, and it was very translationally focused, particularly in the business unit I was working in manufacturing and all the other 20 names that I had prior to that. So there was a lot of pressure to translate, and there was a lot of pressure to get industry partners in, and we were reasonably successful with that. And there's quite a few companies that were spun off from CSIRO that are, and the people that created the IP actually moved out with the company, so they left the organisation. So there's companies making diabetes test strips. There's Polynova. There's another company that's making improved cochlear implant. There's a whole bunch of companies that are actually still going quite well, Boron Molecular and so on. My personal experience is I worked on a number of projects that were translatable, and we tried really hard to translate them. One of them was a kind of universal antibiotic, or a new antibiotic target, a company called Biotechnology, about the year 2000, and I think probably resistance to bacterial resistance wasn't such a huge problem then, and there wasn't really a lot of incentive for the pharma companies to basically produce a drug that might be used for a week and the person's cured and at the end of the day. But I think now resistance is getting to be much more of a problem. So it's a timing issue, I think, in part of that. We also ran into the issue that we couldn't get that sort of valley of death funding to get us from the proof of concept in the lab to the next stage and so forth. And I think there probably there weren't enough people around with the experience to do that. We had another project that right towards the end of my career at CSIRO that was looking really promising. It was a new lead for myelofibrosis. We had sort of nanomolar activity leads and so forth, but it turned out that at that particular stage, I left the organisation, and a lot of the other stem cell people and so on I was working with also left and went to different places. So basically the idea was good, but the whole thing fell over because everyone left. And there was, I'm trying to think of the other example that was good for different reasons.
Traumatic experiences lead to memory loss, David.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Coming up. Yeah, so it could be, the other one, we're working with a company through Peter Mackett and a company, and that was going pretty well. But I think the company had an internal issue that I probably won't talk about that meant that they contracted their research all over the place, but particularly shut down the research in Australia. And so it was simply, an internal business thing. The research was good, but basically they just pulled the funding out. So, but I have been involved in a couple of other things. Just before I left, we also had a company come to us wanting to translate a peptide into small molecules for cardiovascular applications, and we're able to actually use AI and machine learning and computational chemistry to produce the clinical trial candidates that they wanted, and they managed to go IPO, which was really exciting. First time we've actually done something that works. And also I was involved with some people overseas in the early stem cell days, looking at stem cell markers and so on. And some of our technology was used to find some stem cell markers that were the IP that spun off a company in Boston called Asymmetrics. So we weren't heavily involved in that, but it was nice to see that some of our research was translated, although not to the benefit of Australia, unfortunately. The thing with working at CSIRO I found was that there was a push to commercialise, which was great, and often we'd suffer cuts, government cuts. It was difficult to find money for patents. Eventually we can only patent if we found a commercial partner to pay for the patents, and that was really difficult at an early stage. So I'm hoping things have changed since then. And I've only been academic for about 5 years, but I have, perhaps in a biased way, I've noticed that there still seems to be a bit of a divide between good scientists and academia at universities anyway, who are doing good science. They want to get their Nature paper and I think that's great, but they somehow see that there's no incentive to translate, or not much of an incentive to translate from the university. And they even see a disincentive because they think if they do applied research that somehow it won't be as good, or they won't get in a good journal. I think that's changing because I think the whole world is going into team research and translational push. So, but I think maybe it's a bit old. But there's still people, I'm sure there are still some people in academia who just want to keep doing really good basic research and are not that keen to translate. It's all too hard, or there's not the right incentives for it.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a perfectly good career aspiration. I know you're on a roll, but I think we've got about 10 minutes left. And I'm more than happy to coordinate further questions along my own hobby horses and things like that. But is there anything that anyone in the room, we have a hand?
To just comment on the last point, I think it's not just incentives to drive commercialisation. It's also, you know, if you're working as a health professional, you don't necessarily want to go down the commercialisation pathway. That's, you know, may not be your interest, may not be your skill set. Why divert your skills away from your healthcare profession into commercialisation and marketing? That's a barrier. So, and likewise for researchers in a more, you know, discovery science, they're great at what they do. They don't necessarily want to go down the commercial pathway or the actual product development pathway. And that's where a lot of things stall, because most organisations don't have a mechanism to say, okay, that's fine. We've got a team who'll pick that up, or we can bring someone on who'll pick that up and take the development through, and the healthcare professionals or the inventor can stay involved as an advisor, but doesn't have to feel like they've got to lead the whole thing. So I think that's a significant barrier.
I think that's an excellent point. And I'm not so sure it's a barrier. I think it's a career decision. I mean, people have their own career aspirations. They may choose to remain clinically involved. They may choose to remain purely academic in terms of their science.
I mean, barrier to like progressing the discovery through to a translation and getting.
And I think you're right that there are those, such as many of us around the table here, who have a little bit of that in us, but much more interested in actually carrying the ball as far as we possibly can towards the clinic, and then hand over to the right people. There is a cohort of people, and there hopefully will be a growing cohort of people, basic scientists, clinician scientists, whose motivation is in that innovation space, is to take responsibility for the development of a project that has some promise that perhaps the originators may not necessarily feel, necessarily that their career will be where it needs to be if they continue in that process. So there's no question that everybody in this business has a particular mindset and a particular goal and aspiration, but if you can get the right group of people, if you can create a cohort of people with that translational urge, then I think we have a real chance to make things work properly.
Feeling like that, though, shouldn't stop you from doing commercialisation.
No.
Commercialisation should be something that can incorporate the academic founder who wants to be involved all the way through, to the one who's just like, you know what, I just want to keep doing my research and hand all that off. You've got a good team around you like Anne-Laure, and you've got maybe like investors like us around, we'll come in and we'll just go, it's fine, we're going to fund this research in your lab. You'll find 90% of that research overlaps with what you want to do anyway, right? And you can be as involved in that research as you like, right? So you can sit down and work out a path that suits you. It's not a card that says, well, you have to stop doing academic research and you have to go down this path. People can sit down and sort out their research.
There needs to be that investment in being able to take that from the discovery, work with the team that did the discovery work to facilitate that translation. I feel like that's a big gap in a lot of organisations.
You should be able to get some sort of service provision, I guess, to help you as much as possible. But yeah, there is an effort involved from the researcher to some degree. But,
What can be quite contentious is when we insist that we take the project away from those who are academically minded, and that's a real thing, and it is in the best health of the outcomes for the project. I think it's slightly more contentious than volunteering to step back. We have one question from Gail, and then I have a question from online.
Yes, I want to come back to the issue of working with large pharma when you're in a large organisational structure like a G8 university, because I actually think that this nexus between large pharma and the university is really a very powerful way to actually do your research. It doesn't have to be just from drug discovery, because there are many ways in that parts that you can contribute to, especially up in the preclinical end. And my point when I was talking to Anne-Laure earlier was that what happens when the large pharma comes into the researcher in the academic institution is, of course, we talk to you, Mike, and Anne, and whoever our BDM is, but that's just a little part of what you have to do. You end up going to OGC, That when you're dealing with human specimens, you often go into the data protection and privacy. That's a very lengthy, complicated process. You have to deal with another part of the university, which is financial, because the costing models are all very different to the costing models that you use elsewhere, and you have to comply to that. Then you have to deal with all the ethics, whether it's human, animal, patient consent, and then you have to deal with the hospitals and your clinical colleagues and make sure all of that's clean. And when large pharma comes in and goes through your books and actually makes sure that they can work with you, that you're not doing something terrible, it's pretty scary. So I'm on a mission with the university at the moment because the problem for the researcher is that all of these things are conducted in different parts of the university. Some are faculty, some are central, some are here, some there, whatever. And it's actually very difficult for researchers to work through big organisation, G8 universities, and actually bring it all together. And we don't have BDMs, one BDM cannot manage all of the projects that we've got. So we've actually got to do a much better job of bringing all the elements together in order to allow researchers in academic institutions to work with large pharma, because there's plenty of opportunities, but we're just not doing it very well.
Well, anyone can answer that, but I just want to bring together a comment that I heard from Mike a couple of days ago around how BDMs are incentivized and how if somebody was to need to take carriage of coordination of that process, and they are taking an entrepreneurial role in this whole process. So how do you incentivize the BDMs to find their way to so did you want to make that point? It's your point, Mike, so. Or not? Are you on mic, by the way? Is that, have you? Oh.
The reason why Gail pointed at me and said, we'll come and talk to you, Mike, is because I used to work at Monash when Gail was there, so we used to work together. So I used to be in business development at Monash, and I've also been on the venture side as well. And what, I guess, one of the difficulties of being in business development in an academic institute is that you're almost kind of in purgatory in a sense, in that you work for an organisation that is very focused on research and education, as it should be. And of course, for all the issues we've spoken about today, there's very little focus on commercialisation and business development within those organisations. And so you end up being pushed into a service provision role, I suppose, helping the researchers out, which is fine. But it's in many ways what you're doing is you're doing a very similar role with project management and that you might find in a biotech company in a lot of instances. You're running, intellectual property strategies, liaising with the researchers and with the patent attorneys. You're dealing with issues within the university to try and, push programs through and get them funded, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an entrepreneurial type role. And of course, the competition the universities have is biotech and industry are looking for people that can do that, right? Or venture capital firms. So the whole reason I left Monash and joined Brandon was they offered me obviously a nice gig at Brandon, but they put the sort of incentives in there that you find in the commercial world, and those incentives don't exist in commercialisation in academia. And so if you want to get and retain the best people, I think academia needs, or tech transfer officers need to find a way to attract and retain those people. And I'm not saying that I have the solutions. I probably do on a longer conversation have some ideas, but I think that that's something they should do. And I remember talking to Amir many years ago, coming from Israel, which is an outlier, state, Israel, in terms of tech transfer and commercialisation. But Amir can probably talk about this, but the investment managers or the BDM teams at the Weizmann Institute are made up of, pretty high profile people, entrepreneurs and residents and the like, who are there to try and form their own businesses and spin outs, compared to Australia, where you'll find a lot of former postdocs that are trying to make a career transition. And I think that's a different background of commercialisation staff supporting academia that you see in Israel, which is a company very focused on venture spin outs and commercialisation, versus in Australia, which is very focused on licensing deals and kind of, lower hanging fruit, for want of a better example. So I guess that's where I'm coming from, Andrew.
I think that's a brilliant point. I saw Anne-Laure nodding a lot there. Maybe I should have a chat with Doug. What do you think?
I guess the example, the very quick example I give is that academics get a share in the commercialisation revenues, which is totally appropriate and absolutely fine for their inventive contribution. But of course, the tech transfer staff are often involved in a lot of those conversations and discussions with patent attorneys. Many times patent attorneys and commercialisation people look at each other across the room and realise they've just made an inventive contribution, but you don't say anything about it because you can't be an inventor on the patent, right? You couldn't do that. But there's no incentive. You're not, the commercialisation team aren't involved in any upside. And so what the contracts for the commercialisation staff say is that you add no value by the fact that you've got no downstream benefit. Whereas in the job I'm in now, obviously, if the fund is successful, we can share a little bit in that, right? Which is a nice incentive. I've got no idea what my incentive would be. I just know that my organisation values my contribution, right? If one day it worked. And I think that's what makes the difference. Okay, so being in an organisation that understands and respects what you're doing, and I think I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I'm being given the wind up here. I did get a question from online. I feel obliged to actually share it. It kind of falls into that last category around catering that I tried to put in the thing. And so the online question is that there are lots of moves to create biomedical precincts in many Australian capital cities. How helpful are these in creating the sort of venue, the sort of environment that the panel is describing? Do they work? And are they truly catalytic in creating the flame that might propagate more entrepreneurial and more entrepreneurial? And we have an example here. We have WEHI and CSL and the state government doing something in that area. So maybe just 2 seconds, 3 seconds on that. And then we can probably, unless it's a burning question, call this to a halt. Yes.
Yeah, so look, I think this is a very vibrant precinct here. We've got hospitals, universities, and big biotech. The new CSL building that's going up at the top of Elizabeth Street, as we heard earlier, has got the incubator in there. So let's see how that works. But I think that's a fantastic initiative. We've got discovery platforms with WEHI, Melbourne University. Lots of collaborative grants and interaction between investigators on, in all the different sectors, and of course with Brandon as well. So I think it's critical to have that mass all together to.
What's the rule? Is it the cube of the distance? Is the sort of, we are right now in the very epicenter of this precinct. And on the other side of what was called the roundabout of death yesterday, which I thought was quite apt, we have an increasing distance towards the city. Humans are humans, and how close should this be? How close should these things be to the actual, benchtop research? Is it too far down the road? Should it have been perhaps in the veterinary school, that sort of thing? Are you happy with where it is?
Happy with where the
precinct, where the new sort of
CSL
incubator is going to be?
Well, I think it's pretty close. I don't think you could get much closer.
I don't know.
I've
I've walked those streets, and
Really?
I get tired out just as I go the other side of the
That's
Peter
funny.
Marriott.
Exercise is good for you. I think.
Oh,
we
no,
heard
oh,
that.
please, no value judgments, please. I think it's a very cruel statement. And
Stanford's further away from San Francisco than
yes,
Parkville is from the north.
yeah, I guess.
In the actual building, I think having the incubator space actually in the building is going to be really interesting for those that are there.
I hope we revisit this in a couple of years and see how the experiment's gone. I'm going to draw this to a close. I can see some urgent announcements about the close of this thing. I really want to thank my good friends and colleagues here, Bronwyn and David and Anne-Laure and Michael, for their contribution. And thank you all for your contribution as well. This has been fantastic.